Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, hell and high water proved to be the same this week as parts of the state were ravaged by torrents. We'll look tonight at the geography and science behind the flooding, as well as the damage done and the coverage by the media. Elsewhere, a former district attorney and an ex-saint were both sent up the river on sex-related charges. We'll examine the stories behind the cases. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Kevin McGill, reporter, The Associated Press. Mark Schleifstein, environment reporter, NOLA.com, The Times Picayune. And Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. Over to Mark first. And the flooding just really has stunned people. It's been absolutely amazing, described as the worst natural disaster since Sandy. What do they call it? Superstorm Sandy?
Right.
You know, a term that we're hearing, and I wanted you to explain this first off, is flooding from backwater flooding. Exactly what does that mean?
Well, what's happening right now is that the Amite River, which has water that flows into it from the Baton Rouge area, comes downstream towards Lake Maurepas. And when it hits the Lake Maurepas area, it hits all this flat ground. And there are tributaries that run into the Amite River in that area. And what happens is that when you get all this huge amount of water from the Baton Rouge area coming downstream to this flatter area, that water gets in the way, and so the tributaries don't have the ability of getting their water into the Amite, so they back up. So it's sort of like what happens when your toilet backs up. It's going to flood out, and it floods out over the banks of the different tributaries and then fills in, and it's a very flat area, so it's going to have a rather difficult time of draining out anywhere else.
Well, is this kind of flooding sort of unusual, or is it because of the amount of rain that came down?
Well, you know, being in New Orleans, we have an understanding of how flooding occurs during a storm surge event when it's coming from south and moving north. And what's happening here is that people are getting caught off guard because all this water actually fell north of them in many cases and then came downstream. And so it's a bit different that way.
And so let's go back to the origins of this whole just weather event. We were hearing that there was a low developing off the Florida Panhandle, but it grew to something a bit more?
Well, it's one of these really complicated systems. You had a lower level low, a low that was on the ground, and then you had a mid-level low right above it that were sort of moving in concert with each other, while at the same time you had a high pressure system over top of it that sort of focused all the energy. It goes along the coast. It's picking up all this energy from the warm water of the Gulf of Mexico, at the same time that you have a high pressure system on its right and a low pressure system on its left, and both of those their winds are ending up pushing all this moisture from the Gulf of Mexico that's created into that area where it's creating thunderstorms over and over and over again. So this storm moves slowly but surely to the west out of Florida over 7-8 days until finally it got to us, and it almost stalled. I mean, it was just moving so slow that you had repeated storms, what forecasters call a train effect, which is that it's like you have a train of storms going over one track, going over the same area over and over again with lots of heavy rain. And the amount of moisture resulted in having what ended up being what you would call a 1,000-year storm, which really is a storm that has a 0.1% chance of occurring in any year. And it's very unusual.
And the rainfall amounts are just enormous.
They're just amazing. You've got 30, 35 inches in some places. I mean, it's just wild. In large areas that had 25 inches, including the entire Baton Rouge area.
So if you wanted a simplified explanation of this, I guess an elevator explanation, would it be fair to say that you had this heavy rainfall that fell pretty much in the Baton Rouge area, started working its way down the Amite couldn't handle it, and so the rivers goes down the other rivers, and they can't handle it either. So you have overflow.
Except that you also had it on the Tangipahoa River, and you had it on a couple of other rivers, so that you had a wide variety of different flooding areas that were occurring all at staggered times.
Baton Rouge and St. John and the river parishes and the Florida parishes, but the Mermentau over in the western part of the state and some of Cajun country is experiencing some very bad flooding as well.
Right. As the system moved out of New Orleans, it moved to the west, and you ended up with Lafayette and New Iberia having basically the same sorts of rainfall event that we had. For them, it's probably just a 100-year event, just because they have more higher rainfall events over there.
Just look how many parishes were declared federal disaster areas.
Well, we've got
unprecedented.
20 so far.
Yeah, I think 20.
And the worst numbers are in 4 parishes so far, according to FEMA this morning: East Baton Rouge, Livingston, St. Helena, and Tangipahoa. 145,000 structures flooded. And of those, 46,000 with over 5 feet of water.
I'll tell you, one of our meteorologists at WWL put it in terms, and I'm no hydrologist, but in terms that really captured the volume of this event, which was that the amount of rain dumped on Louisiana was the equivalent of 15 Superdomes. That's just a lot of water.
That's an enormous amount of
And
water.
supposedly it was more than fell in Los Angeles in 4 years or something. But I want to ask you, the term Great Flood was long ago applied to the flood of 1927. And I know that's a totally different event. That was snow melt coming down the Mississippi River. This was not a Mississippi River flood. But in terms of a flood event, do we know yet how the two compared?
It's nowhere near what the 1927 rainfall events, plural, were for that one. But it's significant for Louisiana. I think it pretty much beats the May 8, 1995 rainfall event that flooded a lot of New Orleans and this area. It's still hard to tell. They're still trying to figure out exactly where it stands in that.
And how that's compared to Katrina?
Well, Katrina is a storm that caused a different kind of flooding, the storm surge flooding, and you had, of course, in the New Orleans area, you had the failures of the flood walls that affected it as well, and but you had a 90-mile swath of area where you had dramatic flooding. Well over 200,000 homes were destroyed.
As a matter of fact, I think I was looking at something from the data center from here in New Orleans for the 10th anniversary last year, and they said there were actually on the Gulf Coast 1 million structures affected, and maybe half of those in Louisiana. Of course, a great deal of them, most of them probably here in the New Orleans metro area.
Well, we're looking at this number, as Mark just said, 145,000 structures.
That's just in 4 parishes counted as of this morning, and it's going to be a while before we get some real numbers.
Really get the tally
it's
of
going
that.
to be significant.
But there's so many people who have been impacted by this. And I know that you have been, Kevin, you've been talking to some of these folks and communities like Baton Rouge. Just exactly where in Baton Rouge, what was impacted there?
Yeah, I would be hard pressed to say. Mark may be able to help me with this. I went to areas. The other day I went up I-12 and into Livingston Parish first, and so into Albany, where and of course the recurring theme on this is so many places flooded where people never thought it would flood, never had seen it flood. One of the first people I talked to was an auto parts place in Albany. He'd been in his family for 70 years. He was almost 60 years old. He'd never seen water come within 200 yards of the place. And last Sunday, the gas pumps were covered with water. You go all on into Denham Springs, which was almost completely underwater. The entire city was almost covered. There was about 10 to 15% of the people who weren't. Go back down into Baton Rouge. The part where I was in North Baton Rouge. I went through the Glen Oaks community, and by then people were trying to muck out the houses. For anyone who was here 11 years ago, this is very eerie and jarring because the scenes, you don't have those apocalyptic scenes like you had in Lower Nine or Lakeview, where cars overturned and houses sitting in each other's yards. But that scene of misery of people just working their behinds off, pulling stuff out of the house, starting to gut, piling the smelly trash into the yards is really dispiriting. It's especially dispiriting in Baton Rouge, which is a city that has gone through a lot in the last 4 or 5 weeks. And I was in the Glen Oaks area, which is in North Baton Rouge, not far from where Alton Sterling was killed in the confrontation with police, not that far from where the 3 police officers were among those ambushed, and those 3 officers who died, all 3 of whom lived in Denham Springs, as a matter of fact, and talking with people about everything they've gone through. It was a source of one of the most jarring interviews I've ever had, and it was, I walked up to a man who was a frail man in his early 50s who had just undergone spinal surgery. He'd not just undergone, he was had undergone spinal surgery some years back and was trying to pull stuff out of his house. And we began talking about everything that Baton Rouge has gone through in the last month or so. He was an acquaintance of Alton Sterling and a friend of the Alton Sterling's family. And we started talking. He was angry about the shooting. Well, I asked him about the police officers, and he said, "What was your reaction when you heard the police officers were killed?" Again, one of the most jarring things that's ever happened. He said, "I was happy." And we started talking about it, and he said, "I was happy, but I was immediately guilty because I began realizing that they have families too." And then we talked some more about it, and he said, of all people, because this man is standing, there's still a 1/4 inch of water in his house, and it is pure misery in that house. It smells like it used to smell around here after Hurricane Katrina. And he started thinking, of all things, how hopeful he was, because he said this flood was bringing people together. This is a recurring theme in Baton Rouge right now, and it may be overly optimistic. The problems that brought forth what happened a month ago are going to be there for a while. We said this is bringing people together. He said there are white volunteers coming to his house and helping him gut. He is very proud of that. And he said, you know, it may take a disaster to bring a city together like this.
And we are seeing community-wide in all these various communities, people coming together, helping their neighbors, helping people they don't know, helping strangers. Let's talk a little bit about government response right now. FEMA, how has FEMA responded?
Well, the governor seems to think FEMA is responding well so far, but it's, you know, only time's going to tell on that. We were talking before the show about presidential visits. You know, President Obama came under some criticism for not showing up right away. And it's not so much that the president is going to make much of a difference if he shows up in terms of government response. I think President Bush's problems had been not so, certainly the optics were bad, that picture of him looking out over, but it was the government response that was the problem. Ultimately, the next few weeks are going to tell, because no one was expecting, and this is again an unprecedented event. You're always preparing for the next disaster. Who knows how well prepared we're going to be for this one.
And we're hearing that so many of those impacted, so many flooded out, did not have flood insurance.
Yeah, over and over again. Everywhere you go, they'd never flooded before. They were not in a flood zone. Their mortgage companies didn't require flood insurance. We talked to someone who literally signed the papers closing on their house a week ago yesterday. A week ago today, they began flooding, and they did not have flood insurance. So it's just a sad situation.
Some numbers for that. There have been 22,000 national flood insurance policy claims filed in those 4 parishes, East Baton Rouge, Livingston, St. Helena, and Tangipahoa. There are only 45,000 policies in those 4 parishes. Yeah. That's a small percentage. And the reason for that is that I'm sure that the majority of people who were flooded are in X zones, zones where they did not have to have insurance. But as the National Flood Insurance Program says, wherever you are, you should get flood insurance. It's cheap when you're in an X zone.
$400, right? $4 a year.
$400 or about that. I mean, we've heard from so many people. As you said, it has never flooded here before.
And the costs are, you know, I've seen some estimates of costs for you know, how much it's going to cost to fix your home. For a 6-inch flood, $40,000 is an estimate for an average amount. And if you add that up for the 145,000, that's $5.8 billion, even if it were just 6 inches.
A major disaster, which many feel that the national media just did not pay enough attention to. They're sort of late coming to it. Errol?
Yeah, you're right. People feel that. I tell you, it caught a lot of people off. It caught people off guard in New Orleans. I could say it caught me off guard too, because what happened? We've been hearing for days about this flooding event, that there might be high waters, there's rains coming, and if you were in New Orleans proper, you saw some rain, but really nothing really happened. I mean, there was some fairly insignificant rain, and the first sort of like face attached to the event, at least from my perspective, was these stories went out about Jim Hawthorne, the LSU announcer, that he had been lost in the the flooding, and then all of a sudden it attached their face and said, well, this must really be serious, what's going on out there? And then you started to realize the impact of what was going on here. So I think people were caught a little bit off guard. Nonetheless, I thought television did a really good job. Some of the crews that they were able to rush out there, and it was really a television story at the beginning. You always have Mark that people want to rely on to explain this all to them, and so I thought the media, considering it was a weekend in the summer when a lot of people are off to the good job, and again with the Associated Press, with what they do, and so in that sense it was about as good as you can expect. But the national issue, my thought about it is this: it may not be the popular thought, because I know some people are critical and they're saying, well, it didn't get the attention that Sandy got because Sandy was by New York and by Washington. It's this East Coast bias. But the thing is that New York is a really terribly important place on the globe. I mean, it's the economic center of the world, and Washington is the political center of the world. And so when there is a major tragic event that was about to affect both cities, that is huge news. And plus, that type of weather phenomenon was fairly unique. You didn't hear about that sort of thing hitting an East Coast city. I mean, you heard about it with Gulf Coast cities all the time, as you understood it. And so it was something different. And so you can understand that the coverage not being what it was for Sandy just because of the circumstances.
I'm hoping that it's going to get a little more today. Even today, when Donald Trump was in the area, a lot of the coverage pivoted back to the fact that his campaign was being shaken up. So President Obama, after the early criticism, is supposed to be here early next week. The value of that, it won't affect the government response so much, but maybe people need help, volunteer help gutting houses. It's going to be like Katrina, and hopefully this will shine a light on it, and maybe we'll get more of those volunteer groups coming in to help out.
And also congressional interest, too. Yes. When you have national exposure, there seems to be a little bit more concern and interest on the issue, and people are going to need help here.
Well, that's going to become a much bigger story later. Mm-hmm. There wasn't the anticipation in advance the way you have with a hurricane or a tropical storm, bracing where's the landfall going to be and waiting for the results of a huge storm. This was so slow, gradual, spread out, and it didn't hit a major population center except perhaps Baton Rouge. So to catch up to all of these small towns, along all of these different rivers and tributaries, it took some time. It took some time for our TV crews to get to all of the places that turned out to be underwater, with in some cases 90% of all structures flooded. Yeah,
if it would have hit New Orleans, it would have gotten more attention. But I guess you could say, well, they just biased in favor of New Orleans. But New Orleans is a global city. I mean, that draws global attention. So I don't think there's necessarily a media bias. You have to select where your stories are. And as you say, and you can see it in the TV coverage, that the TV crews are all over the place. You just don't know where to go, and so they're going like from one they're using the parishes as political boundaries, one spot to the other, and it's really hard to tell. I mean, where's the center of the story? It's all over the place.
We were sending crews, to one spot only to hear that it was flooding even worse at another spot and moving them in the middle of the day.
Yeah, I mean, the shooting tragedies in Baton Rouge, the media knew where it happened. I mean, they knew where to go, but this was all over the place.
Well, Mark, there are still areas being flooded, or in St. James Parish?
There are some areas along the lower Amite and all around past Manchac in that area that are still taking on water today.
Well, as you pointed out, Kevin, I mean, we can just really feel their pain because we lived through it just a mere, 11 years ago. And just hearing the term white goods, sends shivers up our spine. So all the best to these folks, and they definitely are going to need our help. Let's go over now to Mike, talk about something else, shift gears a little bit here. And we have two pretty prominent individuals in this region who are headed to jail. Why don't you tell us about that and who they are?
Well, yeah, we'll start with Harry Morrell, the 33-year district attorney in St. Charles Parish. And this was a case that it made a few ripples when rumors of sexual misconduct by him while in office began to surface. But it died down very quickly with his resignation. And it looked like this case basically wrapped up without criminal charges. And it was only earlier this year that the U.S. Attorney's Office, in a case that had basically been discarded, was revived based on recorded conversations and wiretaps of a woman who tragically passed away in the middle of this undercover FBI investigation, and Harry Morrell was forced to plead guilty to a single count of obstruction of justice. That turned out to be the tip of the iceberg, as we heard from the U.S. Attorney Ken Polite and the FBI chief calling him a sexual predator who took sexual advantage of more than 20 women over more than 20 years while in office, and basically picking out targets, women who either came to him for help or were in trouble with the law, and exploiting them, forcing them into sex or soliciting sex in exchange for some legal help.
And so he was sentenced this week, too.
Got 3 years, which some people thought was rather light, considering the weight of the allegations, but all that they had that they could really take to court was the obstruction of justice, in which he had caught on wiretaps, told this woman to destroy a memory card of a camera that had some pictures of them in an inappropriate meeting.
And the judge said, if you don't like the sentence, don't blame the judge, blame the prosecutor.
That's right. Now, what was rather striking, the accounts of these women were largely, not known to the general public. The FBI brought them in front of a grand jury, and at this sentencing hearing, no victims were allowed to speak. There was one opportunity of the mother of the deceased woman, but a victim, a woman from 20 years earlier, filed a letter of her account, and it was sordid, and it was emotional, and she was very emotional, and it just really kind of hit home that he kept this sort of behavior up for decades while in the most powerful
position there
position
in St. Charles Parish. And it was Judge Engelhardt, is that who?
Kurt Engelhardt, that's correct.
Who sentenced him. And that was the maximum that could be sentenced, was 3 years for
3
on that
years
charge.
was the max.
Okay, let me get you to talk now quickly about Darren Sharper's case.
Well, related in the sense that they pleaded to sex charges. As we well know, by this point, in 4 different states, accused of spiking women's drinks and having sex, raping them while incapacitated, and in a global plea deal a year and a half ago, when all of this broke, an agreement was made for him to serve 10 years in prison. At the point, he had already served a year, so it meant 9 more years. Well, after all the 4 different states, Arizona, California, Nevada, and Louisiana, all signed off on this plea deal, the federal judge, Jane Trish Malazzo, looked at the circumstances in her court, and he was only charged with drug charges in federal court, providing drugs for the purpose of sexually abusing these women. And she looked at it and said, that's not enough. For the circumstances of this case, you go back and rework this deal. He ended up with 18 years, essentially double what he had originally pled to.
And this was in court yesterday, and he did make a statement and was pretty emotional.
First time he had really said anything of substance. He cried. He apologized. He said, I apologize 1,000 times to my victims. And then a victim, giving a victim impact statement, took the stand and just was blistering and ended her time on the stand by looking at him and telling him to go to hell. 2 very, very sorry, sad cases that you just have a hard time wrapping your head around, understanding why they even happened. The powerful, the successful, and look what it comes to. Yeah, okay, Mike, thanks. Over now to Errol real quick. Well, they made it official. We're getting the All-Star game, the NBA All-Star game.
Yeah, it's been out there ever since the NBA removed the game from Charlotte because of the North Carolina legislature not responding on gay and transsexual issues. And so it had been rumored, it had been said that it was going to go to New Orleans. It took a few weeks for it to happen. Probably one of the issues, I'm guessing, is that it's the first week of the Carnival Parade. So there's probably been a lot of behind the scenes moving around. But that's happened before where there's been a big event during that first week. And the first weekend is not the same as the second weekend in terms of the crowds that are drawn around. You can probably still have that Saturday parades without any problem. I guess they'd have to do something with the Sunday parades. But it's a big event, and it's going to be a boon for the Smoothie King Center, which is going to get a lot of publicity at the time when it's trying to expand globally. But there's a real touchy-feely aspect to the All-Star game. This could be the third one that New Orleans Orleans has had since in the very brief time that it's had
Isn't that amazing?
an NBA franchise. Yeah, I mean, in terms of our performance on the court, we don't deserve it, okay? But in terms of our performance as a community, I mean, we're the best forever. This is the third All-Star game, and New Orleans had the infrastructure. But what was curious about it is in the announcements today, they really worked in being able to be supportive for the flood victims. So back when this first started, that wasn't a factor, but they did talk about that the Pelicans and the Saints would do something, make some major contributions to support the flood victims. And they do a lot of those sort of things during the weekend. And so the game itself is February 19th, but they do activities for about a week going into it. And so it's a pretty busy time with a lot of high rollers, a lot of people with money. And it's different from a Super Bowl in that for a Super Bowl, the people that come, well, first of all, largely the people from the cities of the teams that are playing in the Super Bowl. And a lot of people, if they can, come in that morning or leave and all this. Whereas the All-Star game, it's people from all over. There's no one city that's specific. And so it's really people that are coming for the event and who really take part in things in the community. So it's a good thing to have.
It's good news, and we're happy to have it.
Absolutely.
Okay, now looking ahead, Errol.
Look ahead. Oh, God. Come back to me. I forgot my thing.
Okay.
I would tell everyone to look ahead to Evacuteer, the volunteer organization here that helps people get out of town when a hurricane's coming. They announced today efforts to get volunteers together to help people gut houses in the flood-affected areas outside of New Orleans. People who want to help out should be on the lookout for things like that over the coming days.
Okie dokie. You want to go to Mark?
We're going to have a story early next week about one of the things that really is still missing from these kinds of floods, and that is a map that people can look at and see that their house is going to be flooded. And that's something that the National Weather Service has actually started working on before this flood. This is probably going to be an impetus to it. It'll be probably 4 years before we see it.
So this will be sort of like a real-time thing? Is the rain's falling?
It'll be, a couple hours in advance. You'll be able to see something with a color-coded map saying, well, this is your streets in red or blue or green, whatever.
Okay. Shall we go over now to Errol?
Now we can, yeah, I'm sorry. This is the first time it's ever happened. Okay. We've been in our Olympics hiatus lately in terms of politics, which is probably great for the politicians and great for us too. But now that the Olympics are about to end this weekend, we're going to really see the political season rev up.
Okay, Mike.
And going back to federal court, some people might be surprised to know that there is one remaining Danziger Bridge defendant, Gerard Duguay, who was a sergeant accused of helping in the cover-up of the bridge shooting. And we understand that a plea deal is very, very close to being finalized. It may happen right around the 11th anniversary of Katrina for that last defendant to be adjudicated.
We'll be looking for that. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.